Welcome to the next presentation for Module 1, Exploring Values and Sexuality. So in the last presentation, you may remember I said that children with disabilities grow into adults with disabilities. And so this slide, this little cartoon, then I take it you'd rather not explain where little ostriches comes from, sometimes I think encaptures how parents feel. That embarrassment or wanting to put it off and not have those conversations. We can't slow down puberty, we can't slow down how our children grow and develop. They will turn into adults and they will grow into sexual adults. And so what we're going to do with this is to get you to think a little bit about how you feel about that. So this little activity is really just for fun. We're not expecting you to post anything to the discussion board. This is more of a self-reflective activity. And what's interesting about this, when I work with parents and professionals and do sessions, I always do this activity and people smile, because what I'm asking them to do is think about how did you learn about sexuality? Think back and think about who taught you about sexuality, where you got your sexuality information. But then I also want to get you to think about, how do our children learn about sexuality today? And are there any differences? And I'm sure you will come up with some. So when we are exploring our values, it's useful to remember that our values are personal. They are what we consider to be most important, and they're influenced by many factors, such as family, peers, culture, religion, the media, and most importantly, personal experience. And we're first taught our values by our parents and our caregivers, and in turn, we teach those values to the children and youth that we connect with. So it's important that we identify if our values may be getting in the way of us being able to have some meaningful discussions and do some good teaching with our children around sexuality. And how we speak, how we react, how we present, it does impact the values that children develop. If we are uncomfortable talking about certain issues, if we get worked up, if we're upset when we're teaching about sexuality, about children and their bodies, that's going to rub off and reflect on our children. Time for another cartoon. This is a really good example of how our values can sometimes impact what we're prepared to talk about with our children and youth. The parents here, or the couple here, are saying our kids don't need sex education at school. We've already told them about the you-know-whats and the who's-its. What we do know is that comprehensive sexual health education includes sexual education at home and at school, and that children and youth are picking up information about sexuality all around them every day. They're picking it up from the media, they're picking it up from their friends, and the reality is that if they're picking up and learning this information, sometimes if they don't have it explained to them, they're going to sort of fill in the gaps. And one of those pieces is teaching the correct names for body parts. We actually know that teaching the correct names for body parts, rather than calling them you-know-whats and who's-its, is what we call a protective factor. What that means is it can protect children who are vulnerable to sexual abuse. When we use the correct language, it enables children to be able to report that someone is touching them inappropriately, and then parents are able to work with that child and come up with a solution and work out what's going on. If we don't use the correct names with our children and we give them slang names, and usually we do this because we're uncomfortable with those names. We're not giving them the language or the words or a way to be able to report that abuse. And so values could definitely get in the way of protecting and looking after our children and then giving them some good messages. Time for a discussion question. So time to click on question 2 on the discussion board. And as parents and providers, we all have personal values, but what I would like you to think about, and I would like you to take on that role either of the parent or the provider. And if you are a parent, say, how might our values affect how we raise our children and how we talk about sexuality with our children? And providers, how might our values affect how we care and work with youth? So just something to consider here. Parents, you have absolutely the right and the privilege to pass your values on to your children. Providers, we check our values at the door, something to consider. So now you've had the opportunity to think about your values and how they might affect how you work with your child or the children you care for. We'd like you to take a little quiz. So what you will do is click on the link that's provided here, and it will take you to our task site talking about sexuality in Canadian communities. And what we'd like you to do is read the value statements and then think about how those statements make you feel. Do you disagree? Do you agree or disagree, I should say, and why? Is it something that makes you feel unsure? And what are your emotional reactions to the statements? And this is more of a self-reflective activity. And so go ahead, click on that link, and it will take you to that quiz. And so to conclude this short presentation, as a parent, your children need to know where you stand about sexuality. And so for the parents on this workshop, it is, as I say, your right and your privilege to be able to share your personal beliefs and your values with your children. Your values will be communicated to your children in the language that you use or do not use. And it's super important to accept the role of sexuality education for your children. Your children are receiving messages from friends, from media that may not be accurate, and you have the opportunity to correct those messages and to share those messages in a way that works for you. Providers, I use that expression, you check your values at the door. Your agency and the organisation that you work with will have a professional set of values, but your values really are to be able to hopefully share in a professional way how children can develop into sexually healthy young adults, and you play a huge role